Welcome back to A Wicked Historian.
714 years before Christ, inside the sacred city of Thebes, beneath the towering columns of Karnak, there was a door no pharaoh was allowed to open. And on the night this story begins, a 14-year-old princess was led through it. Her name was Shepenwep, daughter of a king, heir to royal blood. And by sunrise, she would belong to the temple, not as a bride, not as a queen, but as something far more powerful and far more controlled. What happened inside those limestone corridors was never carved into temple walls. But the silence, that silence tells us everything. And once you understand what the priests built inside Karnak, you will never look at ancient Egypt the same way again. The air inside Karnak was cooler than the desert night outside. Torches flickered against carved stone walls that had stood for nearly 1,000 years. Shepenwep walked between three priestesses dressed in white linen. They did not hold her. They did not threaten her. They simply walked beside her, with the calm certainty of women who had done this before. Ahead of them, the corridors narrowed. Behind them, the public world faded. Most Egyptians would never see this part of the temple. Most pharaohs would never see it either. Because while kings ruled Egypt, the priests of Amun ruled here. By the 8th century BCE, the temple at Karnak was not just a religious site, it was an empire. Records show the Amun priest who'd controlled enormous land holdings, thousands of workers, fleets of ships, and wealth rivaling the throne itself. They answered to no one, not even Pharaoh. And when foreign threats rose along Egypt's borders, a fragile deal was struck. The king needed legitimacy. The priests needed leverage. The solution, a royal daughter, would become the god's wife of Amun, sacred, untouchable, unmarried, and permanently stationed inside Thebes. Shepenwep had been prepared for months. She was told she would be honored, elevated, a living bridge between heaven and earth, but no one explained the cost. The corridor ended at a plain stone door. No gold, no carvings, no ceremony, just a seam in limestone. A priest produced a key. The door opened inward. Inside waited something different from the grand halls of worship. A smaller chamber, circular, quiet, closed to the world. In the center stood a basin filled with natron water, the same mineral used to preserve the dead. Symbolism mattered here. Tonight, Shepenwep's old life would end. Her father believed she was being prepared for glory. He did not understand that glory, inside Karnak, meant surrender. The high priest stepped forward. He did not bow, he did not smile. "You are no longer daughter of the king," he said evenly. "You are the vessel of Amun." Titles replaced identity. Ritual replaced choice. The priest shaved her head, a sign of purity. They dressed her in simple white linen, no royal colors. They spoke in ancient liturgical language. To outsiders, this would look like sacred initiation. Inside the chamber, it felt like erasure. Shepenwep understood something in that moment. Power inside Egypt did not always sit on a throne. Sometimes it stood in a temple, and sometimes it wore leopard skin. By dawn, she would walk into the public courtyard crowned in gold. 10,000 people would cheer. They would see honor. They would not see isolation. They would not see the political bargain carved into her future. Because the most sophisticated systems of control don't use chains. They use ritual, they use belief, they use silence. And Shepenwep was about to discover just how silent her world would become. But here's what no inscription tells you. The real prison wasn't built of stone, it was built of loyalty. And now, you see how the priests turned a teenage girl into the most powerful and most watched woman in Egypt, and why no one who entered that role ever truly left it. When the sun rose over Karnak Temple, the transformation was complete. Shepenwep no longer looked like a frightened 14-year-old girl. She looked divine. Gold circlets lined her wrists. Lapis and carnelian shimmered at her throat. A ceremonial crown rested on her newly shaven head. And as she stepped into the vast courtyard of Thebes, 10,000 voices erupted in celebration. They believed they were witnessing sacred history. They believed a princess had been elevated. They did not realize she had been absorbed. Her father, the pharaoh, sat high upon his throne, flanked by the high priest of Amun. Together, they represented the balance of Egypt, crown and temple, throne and altar. But if you looked carefully, if you truly understood power, you could see something subtle. The king needed the priest did not need the king. When Shepenwep spoke her vows, her voice was steady. Months of rehearsal made sure of that. I dedicate myself to divine service, the crowd cheered. What they heard was devotion, what she felt was finality. Because once the ceremony ended, she would never again leave the temple complex freely. That part wasn't announced publicly. It didn't have to be. The isolation began immediately. Her new residence occupied an entire wing of Karnak, filled with lavish chambers painted with scenes of triumph and divine favor. Ebony furniture, silk-thin linen, perfumed oil lamps. Luxury was everywhere. Freedom was nowhere. She was assigned 50 attendants, chosen not by her, but by the priesthood. Their loyalty wasn't to her, it was to the institution. Every evening, written reports were submitted. Her conversations, her moods, her questions, even her silences. Administrative papyri discovered centuries later reveal structured observation systems for elite religious figures. Nothing about her day went unrecorded. The system was elegant. There were no chains, no guards at her door, just constant supervision disguised as service. When she attempted to form a friendship with a young attendant close to her age, the girl was reassigned within days. The message was clear: attachment creates vulnerability, vulnerability creates unpredictability, and unpredictability threatens control. So attachment was eliminated. She could not walk through the streets of Thebes without a priestly escort. She could not visit the bustling markets. She could not see the Nile, except from guarded inner courtyards. Her entire world became stone walls and scheduled rituals. And yet, on papyrus, she was described as one of the most powerful women in Egypt. The estates attached to her office were enormous. Agricultural lands, workshops, and trade routes extending south into Nubia. In official documents, her authority rivaled that of generals. But all decisions flowed through temple administrators. She signed decrees that were prepared by priests. She approved allocations they had already recommended. She presided over rituals they controlled. She had power, but without autonomy, influence, but without independence. And perhaps most brilliant of all was the rule of succession. She was required to adopt her successor. When the next pharaoh ascended the throne, his young daughter would be brought to Karnak. Shepenwep would then formally adopt the child, transferring the sacred office to her. This created a chain, not of bloodline, but of priestly continuity. Each king surrendered a daughter. Each daughter adopted the next. The temple remained constant. Dynasties rose and fell, but the priesthood endured. Here's where the system becomes almost chilling in its precision. By preventing the god's wife from marrying or having children, the temple ensured that her immense wealth and vast estates never returned to strengthen the royal line. Instead, everything remained inside the institution. The king lost a daughter, the temple gained stability. And the public, they saw piety, they saw devotion. They saw divine favor shining over Egypt. Shepenwep adapted. Humans do. She learned when to speak and when to remain silent. She mastered ritual performance. She became, in time, respected and even feared. But beneath that composed exterior lived the memory of that corridor, of that door, of that moment she understood power had shifted away from her family forever. Years passed. Her father died. Another king took the throne. And with him, another young girl was sent toward Karnak. This time, Shepenwep stood at the basin. This time, she was the one who delivered the ancient words. You are the vessel of Amun. And in that moment, she understood the final, bitter truth. The system didn't just control women, it transformed them into guardians of the very structure that confined them. But the priesthood's power was growing too strong, too wealthy, too independent. And soon, a new dynasty would rise that threatened everything Karnak had built. In our next video, we uncover the political war between the throne and the temple, and how Sheppenweb became the key piece in a battle that could fracture Egypt itself. Have you ever wondered what happens when the power of faith clashes with the power of the crown? We often think of kings and emperors as the ultimate rulers of history, their commands absolute. But there was a time when another force, one robed in piety and armed with divine authority, challenged the very throne itself. This is the story of when priests rivaled kings, a battle for the soul of an empire. Let's travel back to the 11th century, to the heart of medieval Europe. The world was dominated by two towering figures, the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope in Rome. For centuries, a delicate balance existed. Emperors were crowned by popes, a symbol that their power was blessed by God. In return, emperors protected the church and had a say in who became pope. It seemed like a stable partnership, but beneath the surface, a power struggle was brewing. The man who would light the fuse was a humble monk named Hildebrand, who later became Pope Gregory VII. He was a reformer, a man of iron will, who believed the church had become corrupt, too entangled in worldly politics. He saw bishops and abbots buying their offices from nobles and kings, a practice called simony. These church leaders were often more loyal to their political masters than to God. Gregory declared this had to stop. The church, he argued, was supreme, and only it had the right to appoint its own officials. On the other side stood Emperor Henry IV. He was young, ambitious, and saw Gregory's reforms as a direct attack on his authority. For generations, emperors had used their power to appoint bishops, a way to control their vast lands. These bishops were not just spiritual leaders. They were powerful feudal lords with armies and territories. Losing the right to appoint them meant losing control of his empire. Henry wasn't about to let that happen. The conflict erupted in 1076. Henry, backed by his German bishops, declared that Gregory was no longer pope. It was a bold, unprecedented move, but Gregory's response was even more shocking. He excommunicated Henry IV. This wasn't just a spiritual slap on the wrist. Excommunication meant Henry was cast out of the church. His subjects were no longer bound by their oaths of loyalty to him. Suddenly, the emperor was an outcast, a pariah in a deeply religious world. The German nobles, many of whom were already unhappy with Henry's rule, saw their chance. They rebelled, using the excommunication as their justification. Henry's empire was crumbling around him. He was losing his crown, not on the battlefield, but through a decree from Rome. Desperate, he knew he had only one choice. He had to beg the Pope for forgiveness. What followed is one of history's most dramatic scenes. In the dead of winter, in January 1077, Henry IV journeyed across the treacherous Alps to the castle of Canossa in Italy, where Pope Gregory was staying. For 3 long days, the most powerful ruler in Christendom stood barefoot in the snow outside the castle gates, dressed as a humble penitent, begging for an audience. This incredible act of submission, the walk to Canossa, became a legendary symbol of papal power. The emperor, who claimed to be God's chosen ruler on earth, was forced to kneel before the Pope. Eventually, Gregory lifted the excommunication, but the story doesn't end there. The struggle, known as the investiture controversy, raged on for decades. Henry eventually regained his footing and even managed to drive Gregory from Rome, but the world had changed. The showdown at Canossa had proven that spiritual authority could bring a mighty emperor to his knees. It set a precedent for the power of the papacy that would shape European politics for centuries to come. This clash between Pope and Emperor was more than just a personal rivalry. It was a fundamental debate about where ultimate authority lies, with the state or with the church. It raised questions that still echo today in discussions about the separation of church and state. The story of Gregory and Henry reminds us that power comes in many forms, and sometimes the force of belief can be just as mighty as any army. The Assyrians came like a storm, led by kings whose names echoed through the Near East. They marched south with iron discipline and brutal efficiency. Thebes, once untouchable, fell, temples were looted, statues shattered, treasuries emptied. Even Karnak felt the tremor. For the first time in generations, the priesthood was vulnerable. The wealth they had accumulated over centuries became a target. And in that chaos, the delicate balance between throne and temple collapsed. Shippenwep was older now, experienced, composed. She had survived multiple kings, multiple crises, but this was different. Foreign soldiers did not honor sacred titles, they honored conquest. Historical records suggest that during the sack of Thebes in 663 BCE, vast temple wealth was seized. The economic dominance of the Amun priesthood never fully recovered. The silent empire inside Karnak had been cracked open, and with that fracture came change. Future rulers would diminish the office of God's wife, gradually, strategically, reducing estates, reclaiming authority, shifting religious power back toward the throne. The system did not disappear overnight, it faded, absorbed into shifting political landscapes. Shippenwep's later years were quieter, less ceremonial, less absolute, but her name remained carved into stone. Unlike so many women of the ancient world, she was documented, visible in reliefs, named in inscriptions, remembered, not as a victim, not as a rebel, but as a symbol of a system that once rivaled kings. And that may be the most unsettling part of all. Because when we think of ancient Egypt, we imagine pyramids, golden masks, god-kings, and monumental statues. We don't imagine administrative genius used to build invisible prisons. We don't imagine power operating without swords. We don't imagine a temple so wealthy it could negotiate with pharaohs. But inside Karnak, that's exactly what existed. Shippenwep's story, in just about one girl. It's about how institutions survive, how belief can be weaponized, how power hides behind ritual, and how history remembers monuments, but rarely remembers the corridors no one was meant to see. If this story changed the way you see ancient Egypt, imagine what else history left between the lines. Because the most powerful empires aren't always built of stone. Sometimes, they're built of silence. Subscribe to a wicked historian for more.